The auctioneer's hammer descended for the third time upon the mahogany rostrum, and Helen Pemberton felt as though each beat echoed directly into her shattered heart. Thornfield Manor, the estate that had belonged to her family for 3 generations, had just been sold for a fraction of its worth only 2 years prior. "Sold to the gentleman in the black hat at the back of the room," the auctioneer announced, his voice cutting through the murmuring of those present like a sharp blade. Helen turned slowly, trying to identify the new owner of her beloved manor among the crowd of speculators and onlookers who thronged the great hall. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she clutched the ivory fan, one of the few precious objects she had left. The man remained in the shadows, and she could not discern his features. "My lady," whispered Margaret, her lady's companion, touching her arm delicately. "Perhaps it would be best for us to withdraw." But Helen could not move. Every piece of furniture, every tapestry, every chandelier being auctioned carried memories of a life that was now slipping through her fingers like sand. There was the golden harp she had played at memorable soirees, the Venetian mirror where she had admired herself in her days of glory, the family portraits that had witnessed generations of Pembertons, 2 years. Only 2 years had been enough to transform the wealthiest widow in Westshire County into a woman on the brink of ruin. The investments Edmund, her late husband, had left as his legacy proved dangerously speculative. When commodity prices plummeted and banks began to call in loans she hadn't even known existed, Helen found herself in a web of debt impossible to untangle. "Lady Pemberton?" A deep, familiar voice made her turn sharply. David Ashworth stood before her, but he was not the simple man she remembered. Dressed in a finest quality wool overcoat and carrying a silver-handled cane, he exuded a confidence he had not possessed before. His dark hair, once perpetually dusted with sawdust, was now perfectly coiffed. His blue eyes, however, remained the same, intense and piercing. "Mr. Ashworth," she replied, striving to maintain her composure. "I did not expect to see you here." An almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. "I imagine not. Allow me to offer my condolences on your current circumstances." Helen felt the blood rush to her cheeks. It was intolerable to receive pity from that man, especially from him. Painful memories surged through her mind like furious waves. It had been 5 years since that fateful morning when David, then a mere carpenter hired for stable repairs, had dared to approach her in the gardens of Thornfield. She remembered every word of the embarrassing conversation, how he had stammered as he confessed feelings she considered an affront to her social standing. "Lady Pemberton," he had said, nervously removing his worn felt hat. "I know I have no right to address your ladyship in such a manner, but I cannot leave without saying that. What audacity is this?" She had interrupted him, her voice cutting like ice. "How dare you address such improper words to me? Have you forgotten your place, man?" The flush that had spread across his face remained vivid in her memory. "Forgive me, my lady. I merely thought, after our conversations these past months—" "Conversations?" Helen had laughed with disdain. "Are you referring to the moments when, out of Christian charity, I deigned to speak a few words to you while supervising your work? Did you misinterpret my courtesy as encouragement?" David had hardened then, and for the first time she glimpsed the iron resolve hidden beneath his humility. "I understand perfectly, my lady. I shall never trouble you with my unwelcome presence again." He had left that very afternoon, and Helen had convinced herself she had acted correctly. A lady of her lineage could never entertain the pretensions of a mere artisan, however skilled he might be. Now, confronted with the present reality, these memories seemed to belong to an entirely different life. "I hear you are seeking lodgings," David said, interrupting her reverie. "The town's boarding houses are unsuitable for a lady of your upbringing." Humiliation burned in her throat like gall. "My current circumstances are no concern of yours, sir." "Perhaps not," he agreed calmly. "But I have a proposal that may interest you." Helen frowned, suspicious. "What kind of proposal?" David looked around the hall, where the last items were being auctioned off. "Let us walk in the gardens." This is not a suitable place for such a conversation. Against her better judgment, Helen allowed him to escort her through the French doors leading to Thornfield's terraces. The rose garden she had nurtured with such devotion showed signs of neglect. but still retained traces of its former glory. "It was I who bought the property," David said bluntly. Helen stopped abruptly, feeling as though she had received a physical blow. "You? The past 5 years have been prosperous for me. After leaving Westshire, I established myself in London. I began by building simple houses for prosperous merchants, then larger edifices. When urban expansion accelerated, I was well positioned." He paused, contemplating the facade of the mansion that now belonged to him. "I built an empire, Lady Pemberton. Ashworth Construction erected some of Mayfair's most elegant residential buildings. I own quarries, sawmills, and employ over 200 men." Helen felt as though the world spun beneath her feet. The humble carpenter she had scorned had become a magnate. "Why did you buy Thornfield?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. David turned to face her directly. "Because this property means something to me. Here I learned that a man must know his place in the world, and work to change it if it does not suit him." He approached a step, and Helen could see the resolve in his blue eyes. "I have a proposal, my lady. You may continue to live at Thornfield, in the housekeeper's quarters. In return, you will oversee the domestic management of the estate. I consider it just that you learn the value of honest labor." Helen felt as though she had been slapped. "Are you suggesting I become your servant? I am offering you a roof over your head and an opportunity to understand that dignity derives not from titles or inherited fortunes, but from character and one's own efforts." The proposal was simultaneously a salvation and a supreme humiliation. Helen looked at the mansion where she had been born, where she had lived as undisputed mistress, where she would now be merely a domestic. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. David shrugged. "Then you will go your own way, and I shall find another housekeeper. The choice is entirely yours, Lady Pemberton." Night had fallen over Thornfield Manor when Helen finally gave her answer. The words emerged from her lips as if torn forcibly, each syllable a blow to her wounded pride. "I accept your proposal." David inclined his head with a courtesy that bordered on mockery. "Very sensible of you. The housekeeper's quarters are on the ground floor in the east wing. Margaret may accompany you there." Helen felt tears sting her eyes, but refused to shed them in his presence. She turned to her lady's companion, who watched her with evident distress. "Margaret, dear, you cannot stay with me. I have no means to support you adequately." The older woman squeezed her gloved hands. "My lady, I have served your family for 20 years. I will not abandon you now." "There is a position for a lady's companion in my household," David intervened, surprising both women. "Should Mrs. Margaret wish to remain?" Helen looked at him with suspicion. "Why would you make such a gesture? Even a housekeeper needs suitable company," he replied simply. "Besides, Margaret knows the ways of this house better than anyone." In the days that followed, Helen found herself in an existence strangely divided between the familiar and the utterly alien. The housekeeper's quarters, though comfortable, were modest compared to the lavish main rooms where she had lived her entire life. The view from the window showed the rear gardens, not the majestic front lawns she had always considered her own. David had returned to London to finalize business, leaving detailed instructions with the butler, Mr. Fitzroy, an austere, middle-aged man who treated Helen with a distant courtesy that made her feel like a stranger in her own home. The household routine must continue as always, Fitzroy explained on a cold October morning. "Mr. Ashworth desires that everything be maintained to the highest standards. He will return within a fortnight and expects to find everything in perfect order." Helen nodded, attempting to absorb the responsibilities that were now hers. Overseeing the domestic staff, managing household accounts, coordinating repairs and maintenance, tasks she had once entirely delegated to the butler while occupying herself with embroidery and reading. "Mr. Fitzroy," she said hesitantly, "how many staff still work at Thornfield?" "Only 5, my lady." "Forgive me, Mrs. Pemberton. Mr. Ashworth believes in efficiency. 5. Where 15 people once worked, now only 5 maintained the vast estate." Helen felt a pang in her chest as she realized how many jobs had been lost due to her financial ruin. In the first few days, she tried to maintain some semblance of her former authority, but soon discovered that the staff received orders directly from London. Her suggestions were heard with politeness, but rarely implemented without prior confirmation. The deepest humiliation arrived one morning when Lady Cecilia Worthington, her former close friend, came to visit. "Helen, dear," Cecilia said, her words dripping with false sympathy as she was served in the main drawing room. "How have you been coping with these circumstances?" Helen, seated in the least ornate chair, for the finest now belonged to the new owner, forced a smile. "I am adapting gradually. I hear you work now, as a common domestic." Cecilia's eyes gleamed with morbid curiosity. "It must be extraordinarily educational." "It is a revealing experience," Helen replied with all the dignity she could muster. "And this Mr. Ashworth, isn't he that carpenter who used to do repairs here? I remember seeing him once, all covered in dust and sweat." Cecilia paused dramatically. How ironic fate is, don't you think? After Cecilia's departure, Helen retreated to her quarters, where she finally allowed her tears to flow freely. Margaret found her thus, hunched over the simple writing desk that had replaced her elegant rosewood secretaire. "My lady, you must not torture yourself in this manner." "How can you still call me that?" Helen sobbed. "I am now a mere servant in my own home." "Lady Cecilia is right. It is ironic beyond measure." Margaret approached and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Allow me an observation, my lady. In these few days, I have seen you do more for the running of this house than you ever did before. The staff remark upon your attention to detail, your concern for their well-being." Helen lifted her tear-stained face. "What do you mean?" "Yesterday, when you discovered young Sally had cut her hand in the kitchen, you yourself tended to the wound. In the past, you would merely have ordered the village doctor to be summoned." It was true. Helen had begun to notice small things that had gone unnoticed before. A leak in the staff's quarters ceiling, the need to replace worn uniforms, the importance of proper meals for those working long hours. The most surprising revelation came when she discovered the estate account books. David had instructed that she have full access to the financial records, and what she found left her stunned. Thornfield was being meticulously restored. Each room was receiving improvements. The roof would be entirely renewed before winter, and the gardens would see new investments in spring. The budget allocated for these renovations was greater than what she had spent on the property in the last 5 years combined. More intriguing still were the handwritten notes in the margins of the documents, clearly in David's own hand. "Preserve original library features," read one. "Maintain rose garden as per current design," said another. He was restoring Thornfield not merely as an estate, but as the home she had loved. One afternoon, while supervising the cleaning of the library, Helen stumbled upon a discovery that left her speechless. Hidden behind dusty volumes of poetry, she found a small, worn leather notebook. With trembling hands, she opened it and immediately recognized David's careful handwriting. It was a journal of his days working at Thornfield, 5 years prior, May 15th. "Lady Pemberton showed me her rose garden today." Her eyes sparkled when she spoke of each variety. There is a genuine passion beneath her aristocratic composure. She is more than she imagines herself to be. May 22th. She laughed today when I told her about the little bird that nested in my toolbox. Her laughter is like music. I wonder if anyone has ever truly seen her smile without the social conventions that always surround her. May 30th. I have made a decision. I must speak to her of my feelings, even knowing it is madness. A man must have the courage to pursue his dreams, even when they seem impossible. Helen closed the notebook with trembling hands. Those pages revealed a David she had never known, sensitive, observant, deeply enamored. He had not simply been an ambitious carpenter trying to elevate his social standing. He had been a man genuinely in love, who saw in her qualities she herself was unaware of possessing. The discovery of the journal coincided with the arrival of a letter from London, announcing that David would return to Thornfield the following week. Helen carefully put away the notebook, but its words echoed in her mind constantly. For the first time since the auction, she began to question not only her present circumstances, but the choices she had made in the past. Perhaps there was more to David's proposal than simple revenge. Perhaps, as Margaret had suggested, she was indeed learning something about herself. As she gazed at Thornfield's gardens from the window of her new quarters, Helen felt a strange mix of apprehension and curiosity about the approaching reunion. The man who would return was neither the humble carpenter she had rejected, nor simply the vengeful magnate who had bought her home. He was something far more complex and disquieting, someone who had known her better than she knew herself. The black and gold carriage appeared in the oak-lined avenue on a cold November morning, its hooves echoing against the path stones like drums announcing the arrival of a conqueror. Helen watched from the library window, feeling her heart quicken as she recognized the crest engraved on the door, a hammer crossed with a compass, symbols David had chosen to represent his ascent from simple craft to commercial empire. "The master has returned," murmured Margaret, approaching with a tea tray that trembled slightly in her hands. Helen stepped away from the window, smoothing the navy blue wool dress that had become her unofficial uniform. It was an elegant piece, but devoid of the embellishments and lace that had once characterized her wardrobe. Fitting, she thought bitterly, for a woman whose social standing had suffered such a precipitous fall. "Mr. Fitzroy requested that you present yourself in the office within the hour," Margaret continued. "Mr. Ashworth wishes to review the household records. An hour, 60 minutes to prepare to face those piercing blue eyes again, to explain every decision made during his absence, to submit to the appraisal of the man she had once scorned." Helen felt her hands grow clammy within her cotton gloves. During David's fortnight of absence, she had dedicated herself to her responsibilities with a determination that surprised her. She had discovered an unexpected satisfaction in resolving minor household issues, in finding ways to economize without compromising quality, in truly getting to know the staff who worked to keep Thornfield running. Sally, the young cook, had revealed herself to be an artist with spices when Helen suggested experiments with more elaborate recipes. The gardener, a taciturn man named Tobias, had shown surprising knowledge of ornamental plants when she inquired about the restoration of the rose garden. Even the stern Mrs. Hartwell, the most experienced housekeeper, had begun to treat her with something akin to respect. But now, with the return of the true master of the house, Helen felt herself once again reduced to the role of a domestic under scrutiny. The office where Edmund used to manage the estate's affairs had been transformed. The dark, heavy furniture had been replaced by pieces of cleaner lines, functional, yet elegant. Maps of London covered one wall, marked with colorful pins, likely indicating construction projects. An impressive wooden model occupied the center of a side table, a 4-story residential building that exemplified the new urban architecture. David stood before the fireplace, still in his traveling overcoat, but had already removed his gloves and hat. When Helen knocked and entered, he turned with a fluid movement that revealed the confidence gained from years navigating London's commercial circles. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said, using the formal address that reduced her from a lady to a mere widow without property, "I trust you have found your responsibilities manageable." "Yes, Mr. Ashworth," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I have here the reports you requested." She approached the desk, carefully placing the organized records of household expenses, the lists of necessary repairs, and her own notes on improvements that could be implemented. David accepted the documents, but did not open them immediately. Instead, he studied her with that disquieting intensity she recalled from times past. "You look different," he observed. Helen blushed, aware that the weeks of practical work had changed more than just her social standing. Her hands, once soft and protected, now showed small calluses from activities she had never performed before. Her posture, though still elegant, now carried a functionality it had not possessed previously. "Honest labor leaves its marks," she said, echoing the words he had used on the day of the auction. An almost imperceptible smile touched David's lips. He then opened the first report, scanning the pages with professional attention. Helen watched his expressions, trying to decipher approval or criticism. But he kept his face carefully neutral. "See, you have dispensed with external laundry services," he commented after a few minutes. "Yes, I discovered that Mrs. Hartwell possesses exceptional skill with delicate fabrics. We save £5 monthly without compromising quality." David made a note in the margin. "And this entry concerning educational materials for staff?" Helen hesitated, fearing the expense might be deemed frivolous. I noticed that some of the younger staff cannot read adequately. I thought that, if they could improve this skill, they would become more efficient in their duties. She did not mention how she had discovered this, finding Sally weeping in the kitchen because she could not read a written recipe, or seeing Tobias pretend to comprehend written instructions about fertilizers when he clearly did not understand the words. "Interesting," David murmured. "And who is providing these lessons?" "Myself, sir. On Sunday afternoons, after religious services." David raised his eyes from the papers, studying her with renewed interest. "You, teaching staff to read?" The question carried genuine surprise, and Helen felt compelled to defend herself. "It is a practical skill that benefits the running of the house. Nothing more." But even as she said it, she knew it was not the whole truth. There was something deeply satisfying in seeing Sally's face light up when she finally deciphered a difficult word, or watching the young stable boy write his own name for the first time. It was a satisfaction different from anything she had experienced in her days of idle luxury. David continued to examine the reports, asking occasional questions about specific decisions. His questions were technical, professional, but Helen detected something more beneath them, a curiosity about how she was adapting to her new life. "Your records are meticulous," he said finally, closing the last folder, "and your decisions demonstrate good practical sense." The praise, however reserved, warmed her more than Helen had expected. "I appreciate your approval. However," David continued, rising and walking to the window that overlooked the gardens, "there are matters we need to discuss regarding Thornfield's future." Helen felt her stomach clench. "Matters? I have received an offer to purchase the property. A London merchant, Mr. Worthington, I believe you know his wife, is interested in establishing a summer residence here for his family." The world seemed to tilt beneath Helen's feet. Cecilia Worthington as the new mistress of Thornfield. The idea was too grotesque to contemplate. Would it be a profitable transaction? She asked, forcing the words through her constricted throat. David turned to face her. "Extremely so. He offers almost double what I paid at the auction." Heavy silence filled the office. Helen struggled to maintain her composure but felt as though she were drowning. To lose Thornfield again, this time to Cecilia, would be a humiliation beyond anything she could bear. "I understand," she said finally, her words sounding distant even to her own ears. "You understand?" David asked, approaching her. "Understand what exactly?" That your responsibilities to me have been fulfilled. I have learned my lesson about humility, and now you can profit from your generosity." David stopped before her, so close that Helen could feel the scent of his aftershave mingled with the smell of travel-worn leather. "Is that what you think? That this was all merely a cruel lesson? Was it not?" She raised her eyes to meet his, and for a moment the mask of formality slipped from both of them. "Was that not precisely what you desired? For the proud Lady Pemberton to learn the value of honest labor?" "Perhaps," he admitted slowly. "Initially. And now?" David studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for something specific in her features. "Now I believe we have both learned things we did not expect." Before Helen could question what he meant, a knock at the door interrupted them. Mr. Fitzroy entered, carrying a tray with correspondence. "Forgive the interruption, sir, but urgent documents have arrived from London." David moved away from Helen, the intimacy of the moment broken. "Leave them on the desk, Fitzroy. Mrs. Pemberton, might we continue this conversation during dinner? There is much more we need to discuss." Helen nodded, still disturbed by the intensity of the exchange. As she made her way to the door, David called out to her again. "Mrs. Pemberton?" "I declined Mr. Worthington's offer." She turned, surprised. "You declined?" "Thornfield is not for sale," he said simply. "At least, not at present." Helen left the office with thoughts swirling in her mind. What did "not at present" mean? And why had David refused such a lucrative offer? More unsettling still. Oh, why did she feel so relieved? As she walked through the corridors she had known since childhood, Helen realized that her relationship with David was evolving beyond the simple employer-employee dynamic. There were layers of history, resentment, mutual curiosity, and something more. Something she was not yet ready to name. The evening promised to bring answers, but Helen suspected it would also bring new, even more complex questions. Dinner was served in the small, informal parlor, a choice Helen initially considered unsuitable for the master of the house, but which she gradually came to appreciate for the intimacy it afforded. The polished mahogany table reflected the golden candlelight, creating an atmosphere that hovered between cozy and tense. David had dressed for the occasion in an impeccably tailored frock coat, but devoid of the ostentation many men of new wealth displayed. Helen noticed how he moved with natural ease between elegance and simplicity, a quality she had not possessed when she occupied a similar position. "The lamb is excellent," he commented, carving the meat with precision. "Sally has outdone herself." "She will be radiant to hear of your approval," Helen replied, surprising herself with the genuine pleasure she felt in relaying praise to the staff. "She has been working diligently to master new recipes. And the reading lessons? How do they progress?" Helen hesitated, as the subject still caused her slight embarrassment. A lady teaching servants was unheard of in her previous social experience. Better than I expected. Tobias managed to read through the gardening manual I ordered completely. And Sally? Sally wrote a letter to her mother for the first time. David set down his cutlery, giving her his full attention. "That brings you satisfaction." It was not a question, but Helen felt compelled to answer. "Yes, it is different from any satisfaction I have known before." "In what way?" Helen searched for words to express feelings she herself barely understood. "For years my satisfaction derived from being admired, from receiving compliments at soirees, from wearing the most elegant gowns. But this," she paused, "this comes from seeing other people grow, improve their lives." "It is the difference between being admired and being useful," David observed softly. The words struck Helen like a revelation. "I have never thought in such terms. I do not blame you. Your upbringing emphasized ornamentation, not purpose." Helen felt a defensive pang, but forced herself to consider the observation objectively. It was true. Her governesses had focused on languages, music, painting, and etiquette, skills intended to impress, not to contribute. "And you?" she asked. "When did you discover the difference?" David leaned back in his chair, his eyes taking on a distant expression. "When I left Thornfield 5 years ago. I arrived in London with nothing but a few tools and a wound to my pride that seemed it would never heal." He paused, slowly turning the wineglass between his fingers. "In the first few months, I worked on simple projects, repairs to merchants' homes, small renovations. But I began to notice how my work affected people. A well-built bookshelf transformed a common room into a library. Solid staircases made a family feel secure in their home." Helen listened with growing fascination. Seeing David not as the carpenter she had rejected or the magnate who had humiliated her, but as a man who had discovered purpose in his profession. That was when I understood that construction wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about creating spaces where people could live, grow, be happy. My commercial success came naturally from that understanding. "And Thornfield?" Helen asked, her voice low. "What role does it play in that philosophy?" David met her eyes across the table, and Helen felt that familiar intensity that always left her slightly breathless. "Thornfield represents many things to me. Memories, obviously. The place where I discovered I could love someone beyond my station. But also," he hesitated as if debating how much to reveal. "Also what?" Helen pressed gently. "Also the place where I glimpsed the woman you could be, beyond the conventions that imprisoned you." Helen felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" "Do you recall our conversation about the roses? You were so vibrant when you described each variety, when you explained how to care for each one differently. You were not Lady Pemberton in that moment. You were simply Helen, a woman passionate about something real and beautiful." The memory returned with surprising clarity. Helen recalled that golden afternoon, how she had forgotten formalities while showing David her favorite flowers. He had asked intelligent questions about pruning and fertilizing, showing genuine interest that had encouraged her to speak more openly than she usually did. "It was that day I truly fell in love," David continued. "Not with Lady Pemberton of society, but with the Helen who emerges when the barriers dissolve. Helen felt tears prick her eyes. But I cruelly rejected you. I destroyed any possibility of what? David leaned forward. Of a marriage based on extreme social disparity? Of a union where I would always feel inferior and you would always feel demeaned? The logic was inescapable, but it pained her to acknowledge it. Then why? Helen gestured vaguely around the room, encompassing her current situation. Why did I offer you this position? David smiled, but there was sadness in his expression. Initially, I confess, it was partly revenge. I wanted you to experience vulnerability, to understand what it's like to depend on the kindness of others. Helen lowered her eyes, feeling shame burn her cheeks. But observing you these past weeks, David continued, I've noticed something extraordinary happening. You are discovering who you truly are, beyond titles and property. And that person is even more remarkable than I imagined. Helen raised her eyes, finding a sincerity in his that left her speechless. I don't understand, she whispered. The Helen who teaches Sally to read, who notices when Tobias needs new garden tools, who genuinely cares for the well-being of people she once considered merely servants. That Helen is someone worth waiting for. The silence that followed was laden with complex emotions. Helen felt as if she were seeing herself through a completely new lens, and the image was simultaneously revealing and frightening. And what if I can't live up to this person you believe I can be? She finally asked. Then you will at least have tried, David replied, which is more than most do. Dinner continued with lighter conversation, but the emotional tension lingered in the air like a subtle perfume. David spoke of his projects in London, describing buildings he had created for families to grow and thrive. Helen spoke of small domestic discoveries, of how she was learning that managing a household was a complex art she had never adequately appreciated. When they rose from the table, David offered her his arm for a walk through the gardens, despite the night chill. There's something I want to show you, he said, guiding her through the French doors that opened onto the terrace. The gardens were bathed in silver moonlight, transforming the familiar paths into something magical and new. David led her to the rose garden, where Helen was astonished to discover that several plants had been carefully protected for winter with elaborate structures. Tobias did this? She asked, touching one of the wooden shelters. Under my guidance, David admitted. I wanted to ensure your roses survive the winter. In spring we will expand the garden. Helen felt emotion tighten her throat. He had remembered, after 5 years, her passion for flowers. Why? She whispered. David stopped before her, close enough for Helen to see every detail of his face in the moonlight. Because some beautiful things deserve to be preserved, he said simply. Even when circumstances change. Helen understood he wasn't just talking about roses. David, she said, using his given name for the first time in years. You don't need to say anything tonight, he interrupted gently. There's time for us to discover where this new understanding will lead us. As they returned to the house, Helen felt that something fundamental had changed between them. The rigid lines of employer and employee were dissolving, revealing something more complex and promising beneath, but also more frightening, for it demanded she continue transforming into a person she had barely begun to know. The following weeks brought a routine Helen had never imagined possible. She awoke before dawn, not from obligation, but from a renewed energy that compelled her to face each day with purpose. The housekeeper's quarters, which had initially seemed like a prison, transformed into a refuge where she could simply be herself, free from the suffocating expectations of her former position. David had established a constant presence at Thornfield, unlike his previous prolonged absence. Helen encountered him in the corridors, in the gardens, in the library, always busy with some aspect of the estate's restoration, but also clearly observing her adaptation to her new life. Buenos dias. Lady Pemberton, he said one December morning, finding her in the pantry organizing supplies for the week. I see you start early. Helen raised her eyes from the inventories she was preparing, conscious of how she must appear, her hair tied back practically, a simple wool dress, hands slightly stained with ink from her notes. "The responsibilities of the house do not await our convenience," she replied, surprised by the natural tone of her own voice. The formal rigidity that had characterized their initial interactions was gone. David approached, examining the organized lists she had prepared. "Your efficiency impresses me. These records are more detailed than many commercial offices I know." The compliment warmed her unexpectedly. "I've discovered there's a peculiar satisfaction in keeping everything in perfect order." "Peculiar how?" Helen hesitated, searching for words to express feelings that still surprised her. "It's different from the satisfaction I felt when I received praise for a musical performance or a well-executed embroidery. This serves a purpose beyond mere admiration." David leaned against the pantry shelf, studying her with that intensity that always left her slightly nervous. "You are discovering the pleasure of usefulness." "I suppose so," Helen admitted, "though I never thought I'd use such a word to describe pleasure. And how would you have described pleasure previously?" The question touched a wound Helen barely knew existed. For years her pleasure had derived primarily from the admiration of others, compliments on her beauty, her elegance, her social position. They were hollow satisfactions, she now realized, entirely dependent on external approval. "I believe I confused pleasure with validation," she said slowly. "I felt good when others saw me as desirable or enviable. But that required constant performance. And now?" Helen looked around the organized pantry, thinking of the small improvements she had implemented, the problems she had solved, the people whose lives she had positively touched. "Now I feel pleasure when I solve real problems. When Sally masters a complex recipe, when Tobias shows me how his plants are responding to the new fertilizers I ordered." She paused. "It's more substantial." "Substantial," David repeated, as if savoring the word. "An excellent description." At that moment, Sally appeared at the pantry entrance, holding a letter with a worried expression. "Pardon me, madam, but this arrived for you." The messenger said it was urgent. Helen immediately recognized Cecilia Worthington's elaborate handwriting. Her stomach clenched with apprehension as she broke the seal. The letter confirmed her worst fears. Cecilia announced a visit for the following afternoon, accompanied by a few close friends who were immensely curious about Helen's new situation. The words dripped with false concern and thinly veiled cruelty. David, observing her expression, approached. "Bad news? Lady Worthington is visiting us tomorrow. With companions." Helen refolded the letter with trembling hands. "It will certainly be a spectacle to entertain her friends." The proud Lady Pemberton reduced to a housekeeper. "And that bothers you?" The simple question touched the core of her fears. Helen found that yes, it still bothered her deeply. As much as she was finding satisfaction in her new life, the prospect of being displayed as an object of pity and ridicule awakened all her old vulnerability. "Yes," she admitted, feeling ashamed of her own honesty. "I know it's vanity, but—" "It's not vanity," David interrupted gently. "It's natural human nature. No one likes to be publicly humiliated." Helen raised her eyes, surprised by his understanding. "But," he continued, "perhaps it's an opportunity to show who you have become." "What do you mean?" David smiled, but there was something calculating in his expression. "Receive them as the competent housekeeper you are. Show them the house, explain your responsibilities, let them see your work. Don't apologize or be ashamed. Demonstrate pride in what you have achieved." The suggestion was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Instead of hiding from humiliation, to embrace it and transform it into something different. "And what if they simply laugh?" Helen asked. "Then they will reveal more about themselves than about you," David replied. "A woman who finds purpose and dignity in honest work deserves respect, not ridicule." The next day, Helen prepared for the visit with meticulous care. She chose her best housekeeper's dress, elegant but functional, appropriate for her position without being servile. Margaret helped her arrange her hair professionally, and Helen chose simple but good quality jewelry. "You seem confident, milady," Margaret observed. "I feel terrified," Helen confessed, "but also determined." The visitors arrived in an ornate carriage that seemed excessively ostentatious against Thornfield's quiet dignity. Cecilia Worthington descended first, followed by two other ladies Helen vaguely recognized from London social circles. "Helen, my dear," Cecilia exclaimed with theatrical effusiveness. "How have you been?" "We were all so worried." "Good morning, Lady Worthington," Helen replied with firm courtesy. "I have been very well, thank you." The other ladies, Lady Pembroke and Mrs. Ashton, observed with thinly disguised curiosity, clearly expecting signs of degradation or despair. "You must tell us all about our situation," Lady Pembroke said in a honeyed voice. "It's so unusual for someone of our class." "To work for a living?" Helen completed calmly. "It has been an educational experience." She decided to follow David's advice. Instead of trying to hide her position, she guided the visitors through the house, explaining her responsibilities with genuine pride. "This is the main pantry," she said, opening the doors to reveal impeccably organized shelves. "I developed a new inventory system that has reduced waste by 30%. How practical," Mrs. Ashton murmured, clearly disconcerted by Helen's confidence. "And here," Helen continued, leading them to the sewing room, "I coordinate all fabric repairs and maintenance for the house. I've found I can save significantly by doing the work in-house." Cecilia exchanged glances with her companions, evidently frustrated at not finding the broken and humiliated Helen she had expected. "But surely," Cecilia said with a forced laugh, "you can't be satisfied with such a demotion?" Helen stopped in the middle of the corridor, turning to face her former social equals. For a moment she felt the familiar temptation to apologize, to show appropriate shame for her social downfall. Instead, she thought of Sally reading her first complete letter, of Tobias proudly showing the seedlings he had successfully cultivated, of the glow of satisfaction in David's eyes when he had reviewed her impeccable reports. "Demotion," she repeated. "I believe you scarcely understand my situation." "What do you mean, my dear?" "For the first time in my life, I am contributing significantly to something greater than my own pleasure," Helen said, surprised by the firmness of her own voice. "I manage a complex estate, oversee the well-being of several people, solve real problems with tangible consequences. If that is a demotion, then my previous life was extraordinarily empty." The silence that followed was laden with shock. Cecilia opened and closed her mouth several times, clearly unsure how to respond. "Well," said Lady Pembroke finally, "what? An interesting perspective." "It is the perspective of someone who has discovered the difference between being admired and being useful," Helen replied, echoing David's words. When the visitors departed an hour later, Helen felt a deep emotional exhaustion, but also a sense of triumph. She had neither humbled herself nor apologized. She had defended her new life with dignity. David found her in the gardens that afternoon, where she walked among the protected rose bushes, trying to process the day's events. "How was the visit?" he asked, approaching with careful steps over the frosty grass. "Revealing," Helen replied honestly. "For all of us, I believe." "In what sense?" Helen considered the question carefully. "I've discovered that I am no longer ashamed of what I have become. They may pity me, they may consider me diminished, but I know I have grown." David stopped beside her, both contemplating the structures that protected her precious flowers during the harsh winter. "And that surprises you?" "Completely," Helen admitted. 6 months ago, having to work to survive would have seemed like the end of the world to me. Now I feel as if I have finally found my place in the world." David turned to study her profile in the golden light of the late afternoon. "Your transformation is remarkable." Helen met his eyes, feeling a growing intimacy that went far beyond the employer-employee dynamic. "I owe you my thanks for that," she said softly. "For forcing me to discover who I truly am, beyond titles and property." "Don't thank me yet," David replied with a mysterious smile. "The journey is not over." As they returned to the house together, Helen felt she had crossed some kind of threshold. The woman who had faced Cecilia Worthington with dignity was not the same one who had wept bitterly in the first days after the auction. She was someone stronger, more genuine, more complete, and for the first time, someone she could genuinely be proud of. Winter arrived at Thornfield with an intensity that transformed the estate into a landscape of crystal and silence. Helen awoke one January morning to find the world covered in a thick layer of snow that made the familiar strange and the everyday magical. From the windows of her quarters, she watched Tobias clearing paths through the gardens, his figure bent against the biting wind that blew from the open fields. Margaret entered with a tray of steaming tea, her steps cautious on the icy floorboards. "The cold is brutal today, milady." "The roads are impassable." Helen nodded distractedly, still absorbed in the winter view. Something had shifted in her perspective during recent weeks, a subtle yet profound transformation that left her simultaneously restless and hopeful. Her interactions with David had evolved beyond professional cordiality, taking on an intimacy she didn't know how to interpret. "Sally sent word that the main kitchen stove is having problems," Margaret continued, "and one of the upstairs chimneys is blocked." "I'll check immediately," Helen replied, quickly donning a wool dressing gown over her nightgown. The automatic responsibility she assumed in the face of every domestic crisis still surprised her. Months ago, she would have simply ordered someone to resolve the problems. She found David in the kitchen, already examining the faulty stove with Sally and the young kitchen assistant, Peter. He had removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves, his hands exploring the internal mechanisms with the technical expertise he had never completely abandoned. "The main valve is stuck," he explained when Helen approached. "Probably due to the extreme cold. I can repair it temporarily, but we'll need new parts from London." Helen watched him work, fascinated by the ease with which he transitioned between construction magnate and practical craftsman. There was no pretension in his movements, no awareness of the incongruity between his current wealth and his willingness to get his hands dirty with manual labor. "Can you do something about the blocked chimney on the second floor?" she asked. David raised his eyes from the stove, dark strands falling across his forehead. "Certainly. But I'll need help to safely access the roof." "I'll help," Helen offered impulsively. The silence that followed was charged with surprise. Sally and Peter exchanged incredulous glances, while David studied Helen with an indecisive expression. "Lady Pemberton," he said carefully, "it's dangerous work, especially with this ice." "I am capable of following instructions and keeping myself safe," Helen replied with a firmness that surprised her. "Besides, I know the structure of this house better than anyone." David hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but you will follow my directions exactly." An hour later, Helen found herself in Thornfield's dusty attic, dressed in practical clothes Margaret had unearthed from the servants' trunks. The coarse wool dress and heavy boots were completely different from anything she had worn before, but they provided a freedom of movement her elegant attire had never allowed. David had ascended first, checking the safety of the beams and installing ropes to provide additional support. When Helen followed him up the steep ladder, she felt an unexpected excitement, a mix of adventure and purpose that contrasted dramatically with the passivity of her previous life. "Mind this beam," David warned, offering her his hand to help her cross a particularly precarious section of the attic. "It's been loose for years." The touch of their hands, even through coarse gloves, sent a spark of awareness through Helen. She had gradually become aware of David not just as an employer or a former unrequited love, but as a man, his physical strength, his quiet competence, the way he moved with defined purpose. "The chimney is here," he said, directing her attention to the brick structure that extended through the roof. "Can you see where the snow and ice have blocked the exit?" Helen followed his gaze, noting the dense accumulation that had effectively sealed the chimney. "How will we remove that?" "Carefully," David replied with a smile, "and with great patience." They worked in concentrated silence for the next hour, David using improvised tools to break the ice while Helen held ladders and organized equipment. It was demanding physical work that left both of them warm despite the biting cold. "Almost finished," David murmured, stretching precariously to reach a particularly stubborn piece of ice. "Just a little more." It was then that the loose beam he had mentioned gave way under his additional weight. David lost his footing, swaying dangerously over the attic's void. Helen, reacting purely on instinct, grabbed his shirt and pulled him back to safety. The momentum sent both of them stumbling against the chimney's brick wall. Helen pressed between the rough surface and David's solid body. For an eternal moment, they remained thus, their ragged breaths mingling in the icy air, faces separated by mere inches. Helen could see every detail of David's blue eyes, the texture of his skin where the cold had left red marks, the firm line of his lips. She felt the warmth of his body through their coarse clothes, the reassuring solidity of his presence. "Helen," he murmured, his voice hoarse with something beyond physical exertion. She knew she should pull away. Re-establish the appropriate distance between employer and employee, but something deeper than social convention held her still, lost in the intensity of his gaze. "David," she whispered, using his name without titles or formalities for the second time. He raised a gloved hand to touch her face, fingers delicately tracing the line of her cheek. Helen closed her eyes, unconsciously leaning into the touch. "This is madness," David said. But his voice carried more desire than conviction. "Perhaps," Helen agreed, opening her eyes to meet his again. "But I feel saner now than I have in years." The truth of those words surprised her. For months, she had focused so much on her external transformation, from aristocrat to housekeeper, that she hadn't noticed the deeper change occurring internally. She was discovering not only who she could be, but who she wanted to be. David leaned closer, their breaths creating small clouds of vapor in the icy air. "If we cross this line," he murmured, "everything will change." Helen felt her heart beating hard enough that she was sure he could hear it. Perhaps it already has. It was she who closed the final distance between them, rising on her tiptoes to press her lips against his. The kiss was tentative initially, a whispered question more than a declaration. But when David responded, pulling her closer, it became something deeper, a confession of feelings they had both struggled to deny. When they finally separated, Helen felt as if she had crossed some fundamental threshold. The world seemed simultaneously clearer and more complex. "Helen," David said, his voice laden with emotions she couldn't fully decipher. "We need to talk about everything." She nodded, understanding that the moment in the dusty attic had irrevocably altered the delicate balance they had maintained for months. "Tonight," she agreed. After dinner, they descended from the attic in a silence laden with new mutual awareness. The chimney was unblocked, the practical task complete, but Helen felt they had begun something far more significant and uncertain. The rest of the day passed in a fog of routine responsibilities, executed with divided attention. Helen oversaw minor repairs, reviewed accounts, coordinated meals, all tasks she had gradually mastered. But beneath the superficial competence, her thoughts constantly returned to the moment in the attic, to the kiss she had initiated, to the implications of what was happening between her and David Margaret. With the keen perception of decades of service, noticed her distraction. "Are you well, milady? You seem different today," Helen considered how to reply. How could she explain that she was discovering aspects of herself she had never known existed? That the kiss in the attic had revealed not only an attraction to David, but a hunger for emotional authenticity that years of artificial social life had buried. "I am well," she said finally, "just thoughtful." That evening, Helen dressed with special care for dinner. She chose a dark green silk dress that Margaret had managed to preserve from the auctions. Elegant, but not ostentatious. Appropriate for a housekeeper who maintained personal dignity. She arranged her hair more elaborately than usual and selected discreet pearl earrings. David was already in the dining room when she arrived, dressed with a formality that suggested he, too, considered the occasion significant. Their eyes met across the table, and Helen felt again that spark of awareness that had ignited in the attic. "Dinner is excellent," he commented after the first courses, but Helen detected an underlying tension in his voice. "Sally has outdone herself lately," she agreed, aware that both were avoiding the subject that dominated their thoughts. It was David who finally broke the dance of pleasantries. "Helen," he said, setting down his cutlery and meeting her eyes directly, "we need to discuss what happened today." Helen felt her pulse quicken. "Yes." What you feel for me now is different from what you felt 5 years ago, he asked with the direct frankness she had learned to appreciate in him. The question forced Helen to confront truths she had avoided examining completely. Completely different, she admitted. 5 years ago, I barely knew you beyond your social standing. I rejected you based on prejudices I didn't even question. And now? Helen took a deep breath, gathering courage for total honesty. Now I see your integrity, your kindness to less fortunate people, your capacity to forgive a woman who treated you cruelly. I see the man you are, not just your position or fortune. David leaned forward, intensity burning in his blue eyes. And does that change your feelings? It transforms them completely, Helen whispered. It's not just attraction I feel, David, it's deep admiration, genuine respect, and something more I barely dare to name. Name it, he said softly. Helen met his gaze, allowing all vulnerability to show in her expression. Love. Not the superficial passion I thought I understood previously, but something deeper and more lasting. The silence that followed her confession was laden with possibility and danger. Helen had crossed the final boundary, completely revealing her transformed heart. David rose from the table, approaching her with deliberate steps. When he offered his hand, Helen accepted it without hesitation, allowing him to help her stand. Then, he said, his voice low and intense, we must decide what we do with this truth. Helen knew her answer would determine not only her future, but who she would become in the years to come. The transformation that had begun with humiliation and honest work was completing itself with the discovery of true love. Let's decide together, she said, intertwining her fingers with his. Winter continued fiercely beyond Thornfield's windows, but Helen felt as if an inner spring had finally arrived. Spring arrived at Thornfield with an explosion of colors Helen had never truly appreciated before. From the quarters she had once considered a humiliation, she watched the gardens being reborn under Tobias's expert care, the rose bushes emerging from their winter protections like promises of coming beauty. But it was the transformation in her own heart that most surprised her, a metamorphosis so complete that sometimes she barely recognized the woman she had become. "Milady," Margaret said, entering with a tray of morning correspondence, "several letters have arrived. One of them bears the London seal." Helen accepted the letters with hands that no longer trembled at unexpected correspondence. Months of honest work had granted her a serenity no fortune had ever provided. The London letter was addressed in unfamiliar handwriting, but the content proved surprising. It was from a solicitor, informing her that a distant aunt had passed away, leaving her a small inheritance, not a fortune, but enough to restore some financial independence. Helen placed the letter carefully on the desk, realizing with surprise that the news did not evoke the euphoria she would have felt a year prior. Financial security was welcome, but it no longer defined her worth as a person. "Good news?" David asked, appearing at the door of the small office she had organized to manage domestic affairs. "Unexpected, certainly," Helen replied, handing him the letter. "It seems I will no longer be dependent on your generosity." David read quickly, his blue eyes revealing complex emotions. "And does that make you happy?" Helen considered the question carefully. "It leaves me complete," she finally said. "Not because I can leave Thornfield, but because I now know I stay by choice, not by necessity." "You stay?" The question came out more intensely than David probably intended. "If I am welcome," Helen replied, feeling her heart quicken with the vulnerability of the confession. David approached, his footsteps echoing softly on the oak floor. During the winter months, since that kiss in the attic, they had developed a cautious intimacy. Long conversations after dinner, walks through the gardens, moments of proximity that spoke more than words. But always with the underlying tension of complex social positions and a painful past. "Helen," he said, using her name with the tenderness that had become familiar, "there's something I need to show you." He led her through the corridors to the library, where a surprise awaited. The bookshelves, which Helen had meticulously organized during her first months as housekeeper, now displayed an entirely new section: books on architecture, botany, household management, and contemporary literature. "I chose each volume with you in mind," David explained. Your passion for gardens, your newfound administrative skill, your love for well-told stories. Helen delicately touched the spines of the books, recognizing titles she had mentioned in casual conversations over the months. It was a personal library, created specifically for her interests and intellectual growth. Why? She whispered, turning to face him. Because a woman of your intellect and capability deserves resources to continue growing, David replied. And because I hope you find reasons to remain at Thornfield for a long time. The library had been transformed into more than just a repository of books. It was a declaration of faith in their future together, an investment in the woman Helen had become. David, she began, but was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Fitzroy, who seemed agitated. Pardon the intrusion, sir, but a delegation from the village has arrived. They say it's urgent. Helen and David exchanged worried glances before following the butler to the main hall. There they found 3 respectable-looking men, the local vicar, the village doctor, and a prosperous merchant whom Helen vaguely recognized. Mr. Ashworth, said the vicar, removing his hat with deference, we have come to request your assistance in a matter of great importance to the entire region. David gestured for them to sit, naturally assuming the role of master of the estate. Helen positioned herself discreetly beside him, but the vicar addressed her with surprising directness. Mrs. Pemberton, forgive my boldness, but we have heard of your admirable transformation. The stories of your dedication to Thornfield's employees, your reading lessons, your exemplary administration, they have reached us. Helen felt herself blush, uncomfortable with the attention. Vicar, I am merely fulfilling my responsibilities. It is precisely for this reason that we seek you out, the doctor interjected. The village school closed when the teacher left for London. The children have been without education for months. We have heard that you possess an exceptional talent for teaching. The proposal that followed left Helen stunned. They wanted her to establish a temporary school, educating the village children until a new teacher could be found. They offered a small remuneration and the use of a community building. It is important work, added the merchant. These children, without education, will have no future beyond poverty. Helen looked at David, seeking guidance, but found only silent encouragement in his eyes. I need time to consider, she said at last. After the visitors departed, Helen and David walked in silence through the spring gardens. The rose bushes displayed their first green shoots, promising the glory that would come with summer. What do you think of the proposal? David asked finally. It frightens me, Helen admitted. Teaching Sally and a few employees is one thing. Educating dozens of children, that is an enormous responsibility. But David detected hesitation in her voice. Helen stopped beside the rosebush that had been her favorite for years, a pale pink variety her mother had planted decades earlier. But it also moves me deeply. The idea of helping these children have opportunities they otherwise wouldn't. It is precisely the kind of work you were made for, David said with conviction. Helen turned to study his face. How can you be so sure? Because I have watched you transform from an ornamental woman into a person of real substance. Your ability to teach, your patience with those less fortunate, your genuine joy when you see others grow. These are precious qualities the world needs. The words touched something deep in Helen's heart. Throughout her entire previous life, she had been valued for her appearance, her social position, her ability to impress. Now, for the first time, someone valued her capacity to contribute, to make a real difference in the lives of others. And if I accept, she said slowly, will it change our situation? David drew closer, taking her hands with a gentleness that still made her tremble slightly. It will change everything, he said honestly. Because you will no longer be my employee, but my partner in something greater. Your partner? David knelt there among the rose bushes, removing a small box from his waistcoat pocket. Helen felt the world tilt, her heart beating loudly enough to drown out all other sounds. Helen Pemberton, he said, his voice laden with emotion. On the day you rejected my suit, I thought my life was over. Today I know it had only just begun. You have transformed into the most extraordinary woman I know, not in spite of your difficulties, but because of them. He opened the box, revealing a simple yet elegant diamond ring, without the excessive ostentation that characterized many jewels of the era. "Would you honor me by becoming my wife? Not the lady of a building magnate, but the partner of a man who loves you for the courageous and generous woman you have chosen to be?" Helen felt tears stream down her face. Not tears of sadness as she had shed so many times in recent months, but of deep and unexpected joy. "David," she whispered. Before you answer," he interrupted gently, "you must know that I do not expect you to abandon your independence. The school, the inheritance you received, your own dreams, all of this will remain yours. I want to marry the complete Helen, not a diminished version to accommodate matrimonial conventions." It was the perfect proposal from a man who truly knew and valued her. Helen understood that David offered not just love, but respect, partnership, and the freedom to continue growing. "Yes," she said, the word emerging as a sigh of relief and joy. "Yes, David. With all my heart, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, then rose to kiss her among the rose bushes that had witnessed both rejection and redemption. The kiss was different from the one in the dusty attic, not tentative or desperate, but firm and full of promises for the future. "When we are married," David murmured against her lips, "Thornfield will truly be your home again." "It already is," Helen replied, surprising herself with the truth of the words. "Not because I inherited or bought it, but because here I discovered who I truly am." They walked back to the house hand in hand, passing through gardens Helen would tend as a wife, not as an employee. But she knew she would continue working, at the village school, in the administration of Thornfield, on projects David would build to improve the lives of their communities. 5 years earlier, she had rejected a humble carpenter out of pride and prejudice. Now, she accepted a man of substance, because both had grown beyond their original limitations. The love they shared was not based on social disparity or convenience, but on mutual respect, shared values, and the joy of having found true partners for life's journey. As the sun set over Thornfield Manor, Helen knew that spring had arrived not only in the gardens, but in their souls, promising years of shared growth, beauty, and purpose ahead.